morning. If we could take our seats, I think we'll go ahead and get started.
Did you get it, guys? Yeah.
Today's faith conversation is about hate crime. And I think it's very important that we emphasize the idea of faith here, because I think as people of faith, we have a huge responsibility to not only understand it, but to try to combat it. So it's in that context that I want to introduce Marshall Wong. As you've heard a number of times, Mr. Wong has worked as the Senior Intergroup Relations Specialist at LA County Commission of Human Relations since 1999. He is the Hate Crimes Coordinator and the principal author of the Hate Crime Report. He also staffs a countywide coalition of hate crimes. Marshall, we're just really thrilled that you're here and excited to hear what you have to say. He is also open to questions. Feel free.
As you were plotting, you might not have heard that last bit, which is, if you feel at any point during the presentation that you have a question or a comment, just jump in, because you don't have to wait until the end. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's been kind of exciting because we've had a number of different tech glitches, but over the last 2 years, that's kind of become the norm. I also wanted to begin by, I guess, welcoming back Pastor Mark after a long absence. I met Pastor Mark some months ago when he attended a presentation that I did for the
Department of Mental Health, Clergy Roundtable.
Yeah, and he said, I've got another audience that I think that you should, address, and I was happy to agree to spend my Sunday morning with you. I work at the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations, which is a small agency serving a very large county. We were created actually in response to a series of hate crimes that occurred back in the 1940s. You might be familiar with the Zoot Suit riots, which was immortalized in a film, in a Broadway musical. And the County Board of Supervisors at that time thought that they needed to have an agency created to be their eyes and ears at the community level to detect any kind of conflict which had the potential of blowing up into something that was going to be a larger civil disturbance. The agency has done a number of things over the years, but one of the things that we've consistently worked on is documenting and training law enforcement and service providers about the issue of hate crime, which has become, sadly, in the last few weeks, in the national headlines again. Just a word about my background. I went to school up the street from here, to both as an undergraduate studying sociology of racial and ethnic groups, and then later in the social welfare program at UCLA, where I did my master's research on the city of Monterey Park, which back when I was a grad student was undergoing the rapid transformation of its racial and ethnic composition, and wound up becoming the first city on the mainland to become majority Asian. And as that transformation occurred, it was not without a number of problems, including arson and hate speech and threats. And so that is what prepared me for this line of work. I guess the other thing I just wanted to mention is that growing up, my father was an elder in the Presbyterian church. We attended Bethany Presbyterian, which is in the neighborhood where I grew up, Silver Lake. And our minister was the Reverend George Cole, who had marched in Selma on behalf of civil rights and he was a big influence on our family growing up. What I'm going to be presenting to you is information about hate crime based on our most recent complete data set, which is 2020. We have been collecting and analyzing data on hate crime since 1980, making our annual report one of the longest standing efforts on the part of any governmental agency to try to understand exactly what is happening in our backyard. We collect hate crime data from every law enforcement agency in LA County, and there are more than 40, from colleges and universities, some school districts, and from a number of community-based organizations that will take reports directly from victims of hate crime who may not feel comfortable for a variety of reasons going directly to law enforcement. We feed all of that into a database, which is challenging for a small agency like ours, and then we eliminate duplicates and clean our data and slice and dice so we can get the best portrait of who is doing what to whom, where, and for what reason. I was asked to begin with the definition of hate crime because although I think we talk about hate crime a lot, the actual legal definition varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And what you have on the screen right now is a distillation of the California statute, and I'll read it because it's a little small. According to California state law, hate crime charges are filed when there's evidence that bias, hatred, or prejudice based on the victim's real or perceived race, ethnicity, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, gender, or sexual orientation is a substantial factor in the commission of the offense. So that's a mouthful. So let's just break it down into a couple of basic concepts. First of all, commission of the offense. There is an underlying law which has been broken. Okay? I think that's important because some people actually are very, very suspicious of hate crime laws because they believe it's an effort to control what people can think or what people can say. And that's not the case at all. I mean, people can think whatever they want. People can say practically anything they want. The only time when speech actually crosses over into being a criminal offense, one of the few times, is when an actual threat of violence is made, whether that's like a bomb threat, a mailed note, which is intended to terrorize the recipient. Okay, but otherwise, people can pass out white supremacist literature down the street. They can have rallies, against immigration in front of the Westwood Federal Building. All of that is protected speech. Hate crime laws in no way try to limit constitutionally protected speech. So what would be the most common offenses? Vandalism, okay? The destruction of property. A simple assault where someone is punched or slapped. An aggravated assault, which usually involves greater force that can cause serious injury or involves a weapon. And as I mentioned before, the actual threat of violence, intimidation. So those four offenses constitute in any given year probably 85 to 90% of the hate crimes that are reported in LA County. Fortunately, we have not had a hate-motivated homicide in a number of years, although there have been a number of attempted murders that have been reported. So there has to be an underlying law which has been broken. Second, that there's evidence of bias. Okay, so what is evidence that can be introduced in a court of law? Most frequently, it will be the actual language used by the suspect before, during, or after the commission of the offense that would represent state of mind. Okay, so usually that involves racial slurs or something else, to show exactly why they had selected this victim to be attacked, right? But evidence can also be in the form of hate literature that someone might have at home, or even what kinds of websites they visit. At the time of the Oklahoma city bombings, which some of you may recall, there were only a handful of websites that were controlled by extremists, and today there are more than 1,000, and some of them are very, very specialized, in terms of who they're trying to attract and exchange ideas. It's because of this that there are many people who identify as white supremacists, but they have no local organization to belong to, no chapter meetings, but they connect through the internet with like-minded people, and that's how they exchange information and encourage each other to act upon their bigoted beliefs. So there are a number of things that can be introduced as evidence in a court of law. And then what we have here are what we call protected classes in California: race, ethnicity, religion, etc. So these are what we would consider to be the different communities or identities that are protected under California hate crime laws. We have one of the most inclusive in the nation. There are a number of states that will only provide protection against hate crimes based on race or religion, okay? And it was not until under the Obama administration that our federal hate crimes legislation he signed into law an act to include sexual orientation, gender identity, but prior to that, there were no federal protections, and that's not that long ago, which is something that causes us all pause. So we have one of the most inclusive hate crime laws in California, but it doesn't include everyone. So there are some states that actually will include as a protected class the homeless, because many people are attacked simply because they're unsheltered, okay? And although you don't think of that necessarily in the same way as racial bias, it's increasingly becoming a problem. There has been a bill introduced in California to expand our hate crime law, our statute, to include the homeless. It has not made it very far. And honestly, reasonable people can wind up on both sides of the argument. If you're curious about that, we can discuss it, but there are very specific classes that are enumerated. And then finally, that hate has to be a substantial factor, not an incidental factor. Okay, so what would be an example of an incidental factor? Let's say there are two men who are watching a sporting event in a bar. They get into an argument. They exchange blows. During the course of their fight, one of them utters, a slur. In a situation like that, people often say nasty things when they're involved in a fight, but that's not what caused it, okay? So that would be an example of something where, yes, there was a statement made, but that's not really what motivated the fight. So that would be considered incidental, not a substantial factor. And although I think that's a pretty clear-cut example, there are many examples where you got to turn it over to the lawyers because they're gray areas, and again, reasonable people can wind up on both sides of the argument. So if someone is convicted of an underlying criminal act as well as what we call a hate crime enhancement, what does that mean? It means that prosecutors can seek additional jail time and other more serious penalties. Now, not everyone agrees with this, okay? And I understand, having been in this field for a long time, a lot of people say, why would you sentence two people who've committed the same crime and one gets a more serious penalty? Isn't that unfair? Okay, reasonable point. But increasingly as a society, we're saying there is a difference because hate crimes don't attack individuals, they terrorize entire communities, okay? And so you have a larger group of victims. Let me give you an example. I used to work in the Boyle Heights neighborhood, east of downtown LA, and there's a housing project there, Ramona Gardens. There's one gang called Big Hazard that for years has been terrorizing the handful of black residents there. A whole group of Big Hazard gang members were convicted recently because they threw Molotov cocktails into the windows of several black families who were living in that housing development. Fortunately, none of them went off, okay? Some of them wound up in the bedrooms where children were sleeping, okay? So what happened after that? Not only did those families request to move for their safety, all of the black families requested to move because the ones who were targeted were not the only victims in that case. And so increasingly, because of the nature of an entire community being targeted, our society says, yes, that is a more serious crime than, say, an individual person being mugged or, having their purse snatched or something like that. So that's why we have hate crime laws, to be able to actually elevate this social problem and deal with it in a more harsh manner. Could you please advance to the next slide? So I'm going to begin, and we hope that will work in a second. 2020 was a year unlike no other. There were 3 distinct but related stories that dominated national headlines. Number 1, the contentious and polarizing presidential election that culminated with the election of Joe Biden, but continues to divide this country in unprecedented ways. Number 2, grassroots protests across America and around the world to denounce the ongoing killings of unarmed African Americans by police. And number 3, a global pandemic that caused, in the first year, more than 345,000 deaths, and unfortunately we've just passed the million mark in this country. Compounding the pandemic was a nationwide backlash against Asian Americans who were unfairly blamed for coronavirus and violently terrorized. On the one hand, this was a perfect storm that brought into focus so many phenomena that tore at our society's social fabric and surfaced many intergroup tensions and divisions. Next slide, please. On the other hand, during a year when so many businesses and schools All right, I'll continue. That would have been the cover of the hate crime report. On the other hand, during a year when many businesses and schools were closed and most Americans were sheltering in place, one might predict that all crime, including hate crime, would decline because there was so much less human interaction. Schools were closed, businesses were closed, everyone was staying at home. So you had a lot fewer human interactions between strangers that could turn sour, go south. Sadly, our annual report documented what the federal government and what the California State Attorney General's office has already reported, that in 2020, there was an explosion of hate in LA County that broke record after record. Okay. There were 635 hate crimes reported in the county, which was 20% more than the previous year, and the largest number reported since 2008. And if you look longitudinally, hate crimes have grown 65% since hitting an all-time low in 2013. Next slide, please. Let's hope this works. Okay, so all-time low in 2013 up to 2020, where we saw a 20% jump over the previous year, but we've seen hate crimes incrementally on the rise for a number of years. Next slide, please. Now, the 20% increase was largely due to a shocking 53% jump in racial crimes, which are the top 2 bars, okay? And so crimes targeting not only Asian Americans, as I mentioned before, but African Americans, Latinos, and whites, all rose dramatically. And this is the largest numeric and percentage increase in 20 years. Racist crimes constituted 63% of all hate crimes compared to less than 50% the previous year. Yes?
Just for clarity, are these allegations of hate crimes or adjudicated findings of hate crimes?
These are reported hate crimes, okay? Now, one of the things that's really important is whenever you see official statistics about hate crimes, because many times you will never find the actual perpetrator, particularly in cases of vandalism. You know, it's really hard to track down who left a swastika on a synagogue or on a Jewish business or family's home. So these are reported. But what's really important to know is whatever you see reported as the official statistics, it's the tip of the iceberg, okay? Law enforcement agencies, including the federal government, predict that only half of hate crimes ever get reported to police for a variety of reasons. People may decide they are afraid of possible retribution. People don't report if they are linguistically or culturally isolated. Many people don't report crimes because there's an immigration issue, if not with the victim, maybe someone else in the household, which, you know, they feel would put them at risk for detection. In the cases of victims of homophobic hate crimes, oftentimes people don't want their names in the paper if they are not already out to their families, to their employer, to their neighbors. Okay? So there are any number of reasons why people might not report a hate crime to law enforcement. But there's also the institutional problem of a school district, a city, a police force who don't really want to be that forthcoming about recognizing and identifying hate crimes because it's bad publicity. You know, and if you're, who wants to be known as like presiding over the hotbed of hate crime in Southern California? The federal government predicts that whatever they officially report, the actual number of hate crimes is somewhere between 22 and 24 times that in any given year. Okay? So we see consistent trends, which makes us believe that the picture that we're getting is an accurate one, but we think it's a microcosm of what's going on society-wide. If we look at racial hate crimes, African Americans are the most overrepresented group in LA County. Although African Americans only constitute about 9% of residents, they comprised 42% of victims of racial hate crimes, and they jumped 35%. One of the problems historically has been that that has driven the overrepresentation of African Americans as victims is the large number of Latino gangs that are affiliated with the Mexican mafia. Okay, so the Mexican mafia is the largest and most violent of the prison-based gangs, okay? And they have been at war with black inmates throughout the state for decades. They have given a green light to all of their street affiliates to try to do whatever they can to drive African Americans out of their neighborhoods, okay? Which, the example I gave earlier of the Ramona housing project is a prime example. How do you know if a street gang is affiliated with the Mexican mafia? They usually have the number 13 in their names, because the 13th letter of the alphabet is the letter M, and the shortcut for Mexican mafia in Spanish is La M, as a shorthand for their name. So that has been one of the driving forces for decades, causing the overrepresentation of black victims in hate crime. Latinos constituted 26% of racial victims, and those crimes rose 58%. Anti-white crimes surged almost 13% and made up 12% of the total. And crimes targeting Asians grew 76% in 2020. Next slide, please. One of the things that we looked at that was, actually we'll advance one more. Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that we looked at were the perpetrators in anti-Asian crimes, which has been in the news a lot. There has been a broad perception that a good number, if not the majority, of these crimes have been committed by African American suspects. Part of that is because there have been some videos, particularly of attacks on senior citizens, that have gone viral. But there have also been websites as well as certain journalists that have seen this as, representation of larger conflict between Asian Americans and African Americans. Well, there are actually very few statistics available on who has been committing these crimes, and trust me, I've been doing research in this area. But when we looked at LA County, we found that actually 42%, the largest group of perpetrators in anti-Asian hate crimes, were white, followed by 36% Latinos, 19% African Americans. Okay? So this completely contradicts the pervasive stereotype of black criminality, which is like, something that is a huge problem. We even looked at years previously, and black suspects were the smallest group, okay? So we think this is important so that we are able to balance out some of the misinformation that is out there. Next slide, please. Crimes in which the suspects use specifically anti-immigrant slurs grew 14%, okay? From 49 to 56, the largest number ever recorded. And 77% of those crimes targeted Latinos, 20% targeted Asian Americans. Next slide, please. Next, let's just take a quick look at sexual orientation crimes, which increased 17%, made up almost 1 in 5 of all hate crimes. As in previous years, 84% of these crimes targeted gay men, okay? And victims of homophobic crimes were most likely to be targeted by members of the same race. The other thing that's important to point out is that sexual orientation crimes are more likely to be of a violent nature than either racial or religious crimes. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at religious motivated offenses, which actually, one of the few bits of positive information in 2020 is that they declined 18%. They made up 13% of all hate crimes. Overwhelmingly, religious crimes target the Jewish community. 88% of those cases in 2020. And in more than half, there was evidence of white supremacist ideology, most frequently the use of swastikas in vandalism. Next slide, please. After hitting a record number the previous year, anti-transgender crimes declined by about 24%, but this was still the 3rd largest count ever reported. And every year, transgender victims of hate crime experience the highest rate of violence, usually somewhere between 90 and 100%. Next slide, please. The rate of violence overall grew from 65 to 68%, and that was the highest rate in 20 years, since 2000, in nearly 20 years, since 2003. Next slide. After jumping 38% in 2019, white supremacist crimes remained elevated at 119. Again, the largest number since 2009. And they constituted almost 1 in 5 of all hate crimes. Next slide. Hate crimes committed by gang members numbered 32, the same as the previous year. 76% of gang-related hate crimes were racial, and nearly all of them targeted African Americans, as I explained earlier. Next slide, please. Now, we also track where hate crimes occur in LA County, and we break the county up into what we call service planning areas. So the largest number of hate crimes took place in what we call the Metropolitan Service Planning Area, which begins on the west side in West Hollywood, stretches through Hollywood, Mid-Wilshire, downtown, over to Boyle Heights. Okay? And the second highest number occurred in the San Fernando Valley. But if you compare the number of residents to the number of hate crimes, that gives you a better picture of the rate, okay? So again, the metro region had the highest rate, followed surprisingly for about the 5th year in a row by the, Palmdale, And that's been driven by two things. First of all, housing is relatively affordable there. So over the years, a number of people who have moved out of South LA and arrived there, they've experienced discrimination in public housing. They're like, the NAACP has filed a number of lawsuits, up there. But also, there's been a backlash by some local residents who don't find them welcome. And the other thing is that there's a group up there called the Nazi Lowriders that has been involved in hate crimes for a number of years. But one of the things that drives their growth is they've actually been pretty successful in the production and distribution of crystal meth. So sometimes you'll hear about like these meth labs in the middle of like the high deserts blowing up or something like that. Some of those are run by white supremacists who are attracting people because there's a profit motive to getting involved as well. Pastor Mark, and then back here.
Why don't you go first?
Well, I'm curious because I saw in the materials that you have been involved in this issue with the county for 30 years or so, from the 1990s, is that correct?
Well, the agency has been involved in documenting hate crimes since 1980.
Okay.
I've been there for 23 years.
So that means that the issue was identified 40 or more years ago. And I'm curious, what, if you took that sort of long view, how you would describe maybe the ebbs and flows, the course of dealing with, identifying and dealing with the problem, maybe moments in time where you might have thought you solved the problem, and then see it sort of growing back. Can you sort of, obviously it's a long question, calls for a long answer, we don't have a lot of time, but can you sort of talk a little bit about the
Trajectory?
Yeah.
Okay. So the largest number of hate crimes ever reported in LA County was in 2001. And that was because of 9/11. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks, we had 188 hate crimes that targeted people of Middle Eastern backgrounds, Muslims, mostly in the 3 weeks following 9/11. This was part of a national backlash that went on. And one of the things that we documented is a lot of those crimes were cases of mistaken identity. In LA County, 20% of the victims were actually Asian, mostly Asian Indian, Pakistani, who were singled out because, well, say, Sikh Indians, the men wear turbans, they grow their beards as a part of their religious practice, and they were assumed to be Muslims, even though they were neither Muslim nor Middle Eastern, but attacked because of their appearance, because of their dress. And so, that was probably the largest crisis in terms of hate crime that the South Asian community has ever faced nationally, kind of a rude awakening to a community that had been largely quiet and politically, uninvolved prior to that. But it wasn't just that one year. We had seen actually hate crimes crescendoing before that. That just happened to be the highest year. And we saw a lot of racialized gang violence in the years leading up to 2001 as well. We've actually, in the last few years, seen a decline in racialized gang violence. It's still a problem, but as far as as a percentage of the total number of hate crimes committed, so we think that's a good sign. As far as public attention, one of the reasons why we document all of this is to try to figure out where we need, as a county, to deploy resources. So prior to 9/11, we had already gone to the County Board of Supervisors and said, African Americans are the most frequently targeted group. There is not a single community-based organization in the Black community that is receiving any kind of grants to do anti-hate crime education and victim assistance. So we were able to get a contract for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to be able to provide a full-time person. After 9/11, we were able to do the same thing as far as getting funding for full-time positions at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, South Asian Network. So we have tried to use this information as a way of getting, our elected officials on board with where resources need to be directed. It's never enough. That's true.
I can't thank you enough, Marshall, for outdoing what you did for the Department of Mental Health that day for us. The question I have is, does the Human Relations Commission have ideas, brainstorming, agencies, entities that perhaps an interested group from our church could come alongside that is actually doing something, training or investigating transformative or reformative strategies to do something to lessen, educate, and turn around this trend, this rising trend of hate among human beings?
So a number of my colleagues are involved in a campaign called LA versus Hate. And if you go to our website, you can get information about it. But there's an entire consortium of community-based organizations and partners who are coming together to encourage people to report not only hate crimes, but non-criminal acts of, like, say, hate speech and harassment, because responding to that lessens the possibility that people will go on to more serious kinds of behavior. And one of the ways that people can report any act of hate, whether criminal or non-criminal, is to call the county 211 line. And we have now trained the call center employees about what kind of guidance and assistance can be given to persons who are reporting. The consortium of agencies also does educational activities, sometimes around, like, an anti-hate week, where there are school assemblies and community fora like this. But also there are a number of creative art projects, getting youth involved in painting murals and doing other kinds of positive symbols within their own neighborhoods that hate is not welcome here. And so, there are a variety of ways that individuals and organizations can get involved in that campaign.
Last question from me. Does the Human Relations Commission partner with the LA Unified School District, for example?
Yes.
Oh, in order to get this information in the place where it ought to be, where you said, from 18 to, if we can get them before they get to 18 to 25, that would be a big plus. So.
First of all, thank you for your truly excellent presentation. I can tell this is not your first rodeo. But two quick questions, unrelated. The first is, you mentioned earlier that there's a controversy about whether to expand the categories of protected classes to the homelessness, to the unhoused, and you said there are arguments on both sides. I'd like to know, what is the articulated argument against including the unhoused? And my second question is a data point. I think in 2020 we had 630 reported crimes hate crimes in LA County, about 11 a week, but prosecutorial resources are limited and there's a proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So do you have any annual guess as to how many hate crimes are prosecuted each year in LA, and then how many convictions for hate crimes do we have, either through a verdict or through a plea?
Okay, we have a section, and for your second question, we have a section on hate crime prosecutions in our annual report. And so if you go online, you can see how many of the hate crimes actually were referred to the city attorney's office, who take care of misdemeanors, or the district attorney's office that is the main prosecutorial body in LA County, and how many of those actually wind up of those defendants wind up being charged. Okay. So that information is available in our report. It's a small number. First of all, as I mentioned, in a lot of hate crimes, no suspect is ever identified, say in the cases of vandalism or people who call threats. It's very hard to identify who actually is doing that. Number two, prosecutors will only file hate crime charges if they feel as though they have significant evidence to present. Sometimes you have a victim who's not cooperative. Sometimes you have other reasons why you don't have, even though you know a hate crime is committed, that you don't have the evidence to be able to present. And often, in plea deals, things like sentencing enhancements wind up being on the trading block. Let's not go through a trial. We'll drop this charge if you plead guilty to X, Y, and Z. So there are any number of reasons why something may not get prosecuted as a hate crime. Okay, on the topic of homelessness, we actually had a very healthy discussion a number of years back with homeless advocates as well as prosecutors. And if the goal, according to some prosecutors, if the goal is to try to get a sentencing enhancement for someone who is targeted for being homeless, some people believe that this should be enshrined in hate crime laws, but there's another avenue you can go. If someone is considered part of a particularly vulnerable population because, they're very, very elderly or a small child or, have some kind of a significant handicap or disability, you can also seek penalty enhancements for that. And so for someone who is attacked because they're asleep in a tent on the street, some prosecutors say you don't have to actually prove intent or bias. You can simply argue that this is someone who was part of a vulnerable population and you can try to achieve the same thing. Okay, so that's one answer. Another answer is a little on the intellectual side, and that hate crime legislation was initially established to defend people over what we would consider immutable characteristics, something that you're born with, or something that's a core part of your identity. Some people are long-term homeless. Some people move in and out of that depending on whether they've lost a job or are escaping domestic violence, or so some would argue that you can't treat it in the same way as immutable characteristics. Okay? On the other hand, there are actually some white supremacist groups that have as a condition of joining that their pledges have to go attack homeless people, and specifically white homeless people, because they're considered a disgrace to the race. Okay? There are also cases where some of this has spilled over into popular culture, and this is, if you haven't heard about this is pretty alarming and disgusting. Have any of you heard of bum fight videos? Okay. These are marketed as entertainment, where the producers of these videos will have homeless people engage in fistfights for cash until one of them knocks the other out, and it's sold for entertainment. A variation is to pay homeless people to go and slam their heads repeatedly against a brick wall until they pass out, and then that gets sold as entertainment. And this stuff is available at big box stores. There's also a variation of copycat individuals who will go and imitate some of this by going and attacking homeless people while they're sleeping on the streets with baseball bats, or and then post it online. So advocates for the homeless would say there's, that the bigotry and the dehumanization that homeless people experience is not that different than people who experience racial discrimination. So there are arguments on both sides.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you very much for having me.